Welcome back to Pivot Points. I'm your host, Dave Allen, founder of Brand Pie, the brand consultancy working with businesses to deliver impact at pivotal moments in their journey. Entrepreneurs are the ones who will change the world. So if you can help thousands of entrepreneurs at once, imagine how much change lies in your hands. Dave Parker's a many-time founder with decades of experience in the tech world. From his storied past, he emboldens others with future-focused guidance that's impossible to ignore. Every word from Dave Parker is laced with wisdom, often learned firsthand. From the number one reason for startup failure to the one quality that too many founders lack. So if you're a fledgling founder or preparing for exit, what follows is a glance at the blueprint you'll want to follow. Really excited to have Dave here today. And Dave is an amazing entrepreneur, founded many businesses, investor. So brings a wealth of experience and leadership expertise to Pivot Points today. So Dave, over to you just to introduce yourself.
You bet. Thanks. It's good to be here. So, Dave Parker, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've founded 5 companies. I was fortunate enough to sell 3 of them. I went into venture capital and sell-side merger and acquisition work for about a decade, and sold somewhere over 20 companies and invested in just under 100, probably 80 something, somewhere in that. I should go back and get all the details, but some of those details don't matter because a lot of the early stage companies get vaporized through the process. So yeah, I've been an investor in venture capital, and it's been interesting to see the journey because in the early stage, one of the things that came out of with that experience was I wrote a book called Trajectory Startup, and that was really focused on what makes good ideas for founders and how companies and how startups make money. So my big takeaway through some of those discussions, Dave, was I hope your idea of your product is unique, but how you make money is never unique. So that ended up being this longitudinal research project of tracking 2,654 companies over a 5-year span and figuring out there was only 14 revenue models used in tech. Now there's more used outside of tech, right? But in general, as an investor, it was a question of what are the revenue models and how do startups make money? Because the thought there is, I hope what you're doing is unique, but how you make money, just pick from the list, right? It's because you're not typically creating a new company and creating a new revenue model at the same time. Went on to, most recently, I was the CEO of the Entrepreneurs Organization, which was a 20,000 member organization of entrepreneurs in 85 plus countries, and really supporting entrepreneurs in the entrepreneur journey. Because what is so unique about that is, all of us, when we started our first companies, had a different set of needs getting to the first million in revenue than we had going from 1 to 10 or from 10 to 100. And, the EJ or the entrepreneur journey is just such a distinctly unique process. And we're asking very different questions at the beginning of the journey than we are the existential questions at the end of the journey. Like, what do I do when I sell a company? What am I going to do for the next chapter? So, which gets to your pivot points questions, right? There's a lot of us as entrepreneurs. I think it's probably the math I've never seen on it completely, but it feels like it's 80% of us go into this entrepreneurship world because, we started a paper route or we cut grass or we probably took input well, but we didn't take direction well as kids. And then 20% of the entrepreneurs, there was a family business and I had to take it over, or it was planned to take over. I went to college, come back to take the family business. But for the most part, 80% of us, I think, are in the ballpark of we're just a little different. And then we find our tribe and we're like, oh my God, I'm not alone. I just thought I didn't take direction well. And the fact is I took input well. I just didn't take directions well.
When did you sort of start your first business?
Well, if you count the, lawn mowing and going out on your own to be ambitious, I was probably over ambitious. My wife and I have been married for 38 years. We have 4 kids.
Congratulations.
Thank you. We always chuckle about the fact that I probably had enough ambition for both of us and some other people included. But the journey there started really young. I started doing photography and doing wedding photography and sports photography and working for United Press as a photographer. So I had a lot of that early, strike out and go figure out your own way and all of those things. So
have you ever been a paid employee of anybody?
I have a couple time in the last 25 years. Most recently, when I was the CEO of EO, I kind of joked about the fact that I'm not really a good employee. I'm a good owner, and I'm a really good founder. But I would say the board and I had a reconciliation moment of like, do you want a CEO or do you want an executive director? Because those are different roles, right? The founder, entrepreneur, visionary person is different than the executive director, go do what the board mandates role. And that there's not a good or bad observation of that. That's not a comment of good or bad. It's a comment of observation of what the organization wants. Right. So I, yeah, so over the last 25, 30 years, I've been a W-2 a couple of times, but not very often.
Yeah. And which is the part that you love the best? Is it the getting the idea, getting it going, getting it certain to a point, and then exiting, or do you like the building bit, or both?
I discovered both in a different way. Like when as a founder, 0 to 1 has a whole different set of needs than 1 to 10.
Yeah.
I had the chance to go in and join another nonprofit called Startup Weekend. And Startup Weekend was interesting because it was Mark Nagar and that team had created a movement. So I will totally give them credit for the movement. I came in to help scale the movement. So in 3 years, they went from 0 events a year to 550 events a year. And Startup Weekend was this thing that you would come in on a Friday night. I'd pitch my idea. You'd pitch your idea. We'd try to get a team to join us. And then by Sunday, we would launch a demo. And I joined them and we went from 550 events to 1,625 events in about 18 months.
Wow.
So what I learned about myself was I'm actually really good at the scale up side. I love the idea side when it's your idea because going to 0 to 1 is so interesting from 0 to 1 million. I always tell founders it's 0 to 1 is hard. 1 to 10 is hard, but it's a different kind of hard. And 10 to 100 is a different kind of hard, right? Because it requires us as entrepreneurs to change at the pace that the business and organization is changing. Because if we don't, we'll get lapped or dropped. And you see that frequently as an organization begins to grow, as the founder they either scale with it or they don't. If they don't scale with it, then they hold the organization back. If they have a board, then they'll get replaced, right? But if they do scale with the organization, then they become what the organization needs them to be. And that's a hard path, right? There's not a lot of founders who do that.
Now, if we focus on that 0 to 1 phase, what do you think the pivotal, for somebody thinking about starting a business today, what do you think are the pivotal moments they're going to have to overcome or encounter as they go on that 1,000,000 to 1 journey?
I will tell you that looking at my portfolio over the last decade plus of early stage investments, I wish I had a test for founder self-awareness. Because the challenge is, as a founder, especially if you're doing something new in tech that hasn't been done before, right?
Yeah.
So let me separate these into a couple of categories. If I'm doing a services business, I don't have to worry about product market fit, right? You're buying accounting services from somebody. The question is, will you buy them from me?
Yeah.
So service market fit really isn't a question. It's a question of salesmanship and can I position my product and service differently than the product and service you're buying today? Is it packaged differently? Is it priced differently? Is it delivered differently? On the product side, though, it's different. It's product market fit means, am I delivering a product the customer wants and is willing to pay for? And as a founder, the self-awareness component that to me is super interesting is, as you're on this journey from 0 to 1, $0 to $1 million, right? You have lots of inputs and your ability to process them quickly and prioritize which ones really matter the most are super important, right? Because it's cash flow and it's burn rate and it's hiring slow and firing fast and right. But it's the ability for that founder to be very self-aware, right? And in that self-awareness also says, these are the things I don't do well, right? I need to find Dave, who's really good at operations to support my effort because this is a huge blind spot for me.
Yeah.
And as I look back over the investments, the institutional investments and, a handful of angel investments I've made, the answer is those entrepreneurs that had that self-awareness factor, they didn't always succeed, but they increased their odds of success.
Yeah. No, I mean, I often talk about understanding what you're not good at is more important than understanding what you're good at. And that founder self-awareness, I love that simple phrase. Is that about the founder actually understanding what they're not good at and then building a team around them to make up for their deficiencies? and so many founders think they can do everything. Is it a self-belief issue, or is it?
I think there's a little bit of both, right? There's a self-realization component to it that says, "Oh, I'm not good at this," and I need to be willing to say that. And in the venture side of the community, it's always hard because in venture, you're like, I have to put the best face forward because I'm raising money and it's got to look like it's perfect. And the answer is actually that's not the case. When somebody comes in and they're all perfect looking and buttoned up, we know something's wrong and we know their numbers are wrong. And we know, like in venture in the early stage seed round stuff, like we know you're wrong. We just want to know how orders of magnitude wrong you are, right? Especially when you see a financial model that goes from zero to $100 million in 5 years. The answer is a handful of companies have done that over the course of decades. But, people are like, well, you need to see the model. I'm like, I've seen a lot of models. The fact is, if you look at the Inc. 500 data, which is the fastest 500 growing companies in the US, and they start, by the way, at 1 million, not at zero, right? Because the basis of tracking that starts at 1 million and goes up. In the last decade's worth of data that it was public, it hasn't been public for the last 4 or 5 years, maybe 6. If you went from 1 million to 40 million over a 5 year span, you would have been in the middle of the Inc. 500 list.
Wow.
Right. And then we're not talking, unicorn, because unicorn is a concept of valuation, not a concept of revenue.
Yeah, yeah.
So for the founders, I always tell founders like raising venture capital is not a sign of success, right? Free cash flow is a sign of success. Increasing the enterprise value of the company is a sign of success. But, raising capital isn't a sign of success. So
Yeah.
it's a proxy, but it's not, if you dig deeper, it's not really the number you're after.
No, and in that sort of first phase, that 0 to 1 million, how much importance do you put on not just founder self-awareness and not just the business idea, but also their ability to understand how to take people with them, how to build a brand in the marketplace, how to align people around their idea? Because those are the things that take an enormous amount of time in that first phase, but often get overlooked.
Yeah, I think there's a bit of a common misunderstanding too, Dave, around the concept of culture eats strategy for breakfast. The fact is if you and I are co-founders, we have personalities in the early stage. We don't have culture. We haven't built culture. In a services business, culture matters a lot because you're buying from my company versus somebody else's company, and my culture should be different than their culture. And like you and I would have to spend a bunch of time thinking about what do we want our culture to be like. In the product side of it, if we don't get to product market fit, the company dies. So your culture, it doesn't, in some ways, it just doesn't even matter because if it survives and you get to 20 employees, we can fix the culture, right? There's people around who do organizational development, organizational design, and right, do all those things. But having the right co-founders and the right team matters a ton, right? Whether it's a first employee or first revenue hire or whether it's, and I see that really common as founders get together. There's hard decisions to make all the way along the line. And one of the hard decisions is how do we split equity, right? Are we 50-50 because we're friends? 50-50 is a weird one for me because it means you took the hardest early decision you had to make and you didn't make a decision.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. So, because if it was my idea and I'm doing all the work, and then how do you come back and reevaluate it? So one of the things we'd see frequently on the venture side is you'd see somebody with, 18 or 22% of the cap table, and you're like, who's that person? They're like, oh, they were a co-founder. They're no longer here. And it's like, I'm trying to buy 10% of the company for $1 million, right? And you have 18% of the company sitting out for a co-founder who's no longer here. So what does that tell you about your ability to hire slowly and fire quickly?
Yeah.
Right. As a tough decision. And I don't say that trivially. It's hard to put together a team and get people to volunteer and put in hours and work side hustles and right. All of those things are hard, but you have to know your blind spots. You have to know where you can't do the work. You have to know what you can hire to have done versus stuff I really need a co-founder to do this because I don't, I think for a lot of us as entrepreneurs, we're like, well, I can learn how to do that. And the answer is you can learn how to use Xero in QuickBooks, but should you? Is it really a good use of your time when you can hire that one done fractionally without equity versus, oh, I'm going to learn how to code. Good luck with that, right? Even in the world of AI, it's still understanding what the product requirement document is, right?
Yeah. And do you get into any sort of viewpoint on whether a single founder, two founders, three founders, Is there any difference in your mind between the success potential?
So do you remember the third founder of Apple? He actually put in money. Do you remember the third founder at Google? There was actually five co-founders. Brian Lent was the fifth co-founder. He went back to Stanford and got his PhD in math. Did okay for himself, but it wasn't Google. Right. So my observation is the co-founder dilemma is really two, is the higher success rate from that perspective. Though I think in the world of AI, venture is under a big change, right? Because you see now a single co-founder and AI with a good plan can put together a company that generates annual recurring revenue of substantial money with no co-founder, right? And that will exit for in the tens of millions of dollars. Now, is it going to be a unicorn? No, but do you have any outside investors or any co-founders? And the answer is, I think it's a really interesting opportunity. It also will put pressure on venture capital because big Series C rounds or Series B rounds that were required historically aren't going to be required in all cases anymore, right? So I think what you're going to see is this compression around how can venture capital be more nimble to meet the needs of early AI focused founders that are really building high value products, but where venture hasn't been nimble in the past and doesn't need to be. You're in the business of selling money.
No, I mean, that's a fascinating thought that founders are going to use AI as their co-founder. I must admit, I'm finding I'm doing that more and more in my day-to-day job. I'm sitting there working with AI as the other human being as opposed to a human being.
Well, here's my sounding board. Here's my coach. Act like a professional coach and give me and finalize this for me. So, like a lot of the things that we would have done with a co-founder in the past, we can get a lot further along now, which either comes into a divide and conquer opportunity for us, right? Or I think you'll see a lot of very efficient capital product companies that have AI as as a huge part of what they're doing. It's
Yeah.
not a I mean, we see this in venture all the time, right? Where somebody puts AI into their pitch deck and it's supposed to be worth 10x what it was worth the day before they put AI in the pitch deck. That's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
We're talking about where you have a meaningful amount of AI doing the work with you to figure out product market fit and speed to market. Because I think what we're going to see the most is I have this concept and this idea of the product. How do I build the product and how do I fix go to market? And historically, people are like, well, I have to build the product first. I don't actually think that's true. I think you can go test customer acquisition on a product that doesn't exist and validate or invalidate whether the customer wants it. And if you're able to do that, why would you spend time building a product that nobody wants? Right? Because statistically, that's the number one reason startups fail is they spend time building a product that nobody is willing to pay for.
And I mean, if we go back to some of your own businesses,
Mhm.
what have been your sort of pivotal moments where you've learnt the good and the bad of being an entrepreneur?
If I start with the first one was a software distribution company, and we were in the business of we were Microsoft's first new distributor in like 15 years, and we were really doing online license and digital delivery of software licenses was our ambition and aspiration was instead of getting, if you had 60 seats of Office, you didn't need 60 DVDs or 60 CDs, you needed one DVD or two and 58 licenses. And the challenge was how do you buy it? How do you configure it? Who sells it? Right. Microsoft always made tons of money with it, but the channel did not. So we came up with a way to make the channel easier. So even though it was a good business, it was a big market, the challenge of being a startup in that space is Microsoft is the one that really makes the money in this space, and everybody else kind of gets table scraps. And this was not in the enlightened Satya Nadella era. This was in the prior generation of that, right? So even though we solved a significant problem, there was tons of market friction. The challenge is were there really ever good sustainable margins in the business? And the answer was, meh, not really, right? So knowing what I know, would I start that business again? Oh, hell no. Not because it didn't solve a problem. And a lot of us as founders get augured in on that. We're like, oh, I found this significant problem I need to solve. The market's really large. The question then really was, is it sustainable from a market perspective? Because our next biggest competitor, we went from 0 to 32 million in sales in 4 years, and our next biggest competitor was doing 1.2 billion.
Right.
Right. So, it was a good fast growth business. We learned a ton, right? But I always tell people if you don't return great shareholder returns, it's not a success, right? Did you learn things? I hope so. For God's sake, I hope you learn things. But calling it a success or repackaging failure as a success, because it was not a great return. right? And if you remember 2002, it wasn't a great time to sell a company, right? Just so post 9/11, post tech bubble, right? Did we get it sold? Yeah, we got it sold, right? But knowing what I know now about the revenue models, give you an example. So in the 14 revenue models, as a listener, if you're thinking about your business, I'll give you one big fundamental difference. There's the 14 revenue models. Are services is a revenue model, right? So we have a markup on people. Product sales and is an example. That's commerce, right? So whether I'm selling my own virtual good or a physical good like Amazon, right? And then you get into everybody's favorite model these days, which is subscription. So the interesting thing about the difference between a subscription and a services business. So let's say you and I did $1 million a year in consulting services and we went to go sell the business. The business would be worth roughly $1 million.
Yeah.
And typically they're going to give us $1 million and then we're going to earn that back over the time we sell the company. Oh, usually 3 years is the earn out, right? Because it's based on trailing 12 months of revenue. So how much did you guys do in revenue last year? What's your customer concentration? Too few customers, the discount will happen. Good customer base, the price will stay higher. In the subscription business, if we did $1 million subscription business we know we have recurring revenue and we know we have churn, that business is going to be worth between $8 and $12 million, even though it's still $1 million business, because next year I'm going to add new customers to it, but I have a base of customers less churn that I already have.
Yeah.
So you go from talking about trailing 12 months to forward 12 months right off the bat. So if you're thinking about just starting a business and you don't know what revenue model you should use, I would suggest subscription if your customers will pay. The other one that's interesting, and you see it in the valuations and enterprise value these days, is what's called metered service. So if you think of your AWS bill, Amazon Web Services, or your Azure bill, right? If you see that expense line go up, if your product is priced correctly, again, product business versus service, if your product is priced correctly, it should be an early indicator of forward growth, right? If you freak out every time you see your bill from AWS, it probably means your price is wrong. Because if your customer is using it more and your billing is going up, it should be a forward-looking indicator of growth. So businesses like that have a multiple of revenue, right, that is almost twice as high as subscription. So that could be 22 times forward-looking revenue. Because again, the customer has more, the more you use, the more you pay. So the reason I bring it back to the pivot point question is knowing how you're going to make money determines how much time and effort you put into a particular business. And one of the challenges I see for a lot of founders is I fall in love with my own idea, and then I discover the business isn't a great business. Give you an example. I have a friend in the commercial construction business. The drawback of the commercial construction business is people pay their bills really slow, but I still have to pay my employees every 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So the first few years of the business, I can sell into bigger customers and get more revenue. The problem is I now have this DSO, DPO, day sales outstanding, day payment outstanding dilemma that says if I grow the business more, I'm just creating more pressure on cash flow. So instead of being a great business, it's kind of it's okay business, right? And it doesn't take anything away from the quality of the services he's offering. It just says, is it the business you anticipated this to be? And the answer was not really. It's not creating free cash, right? And I think a lot of us as first-time founders don't have that concept as a priority. And I look back at some of mine and say, yeah, no, that wasn't a great business, right? Or the customer acquisition was really, really hard, right? Versus the customer acquisition then becomes recurring.
I mean, I've sort of given my kids a bit of advice and not much advice over life. Like you, I've got 4. But the one thing that if they were listening to this, they would say, God, you're saying that again, Dad, is find something you love doing and then figure out how to make money out of it. And, I'm listening to you, Dave, and I'm thinking, you love entrepreneurship. That is your hobby. That is your train set. That is what you really love.
Yep.
But for other founders, how important is it that what they do in the business is what they love? And how does that figure in the sort of, I guess, the venture capital thinking that you guys do, that this can be their passion? So, I'm really lucky. What I do every day is my hobby. And then I'm lucky enough to earn a living out of that. Does that change in your world? Because you just love entrepreneurship and you talk about it like I've never heard anybody talk about it before. It's brilliant.
Well, I think There's a fundamental belief, right? My fundamental belief is entrepreneurs will be the ones who change the world. Not, I think politicians will take credit for it,
Of
right?
course.
We'll develop the tax dollars to pay for it, right? But ultimately, entrepreneurs are the ones that'll change the world. So the problems that we are going to have in the next 20 years are going to be solved by entrepreneurs, not by government, because government has shifted out of a long-term view. And not a political comment, by the way, just an observation of fact,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Instead of focusing on the next version of the internet or really having a vision for what the future can be, entrepreneurs have that, government officials don't, politicians don't. So my core belief is entrepreneurs change the world. So if you could figure out a way to support, if I think about today, 20,000 entrepreneurs are part of the entrepreneurs organization, but you have 40,000 or 50,000 in YPO. You've got 40,000 in Vistage. You've got a bunch of other organizations that pop up like this. If we can support 1 million entrepreneurs a year in a scalable way that helps them meet their aspirations, because it's not about the organization. It has to be about the entrepreneur, right? And your business as Brand Pie is different than my business as venture capital or as a product company. And it's about empowering entrepreneurs to make the impact on the world they want to make. And initially, if I think about those three categories again, 0 to 1, 1 to 10, 10 to 100, and as we get older, right, and we're in the biggest transfer of wealth in the history of humanity, right, as baby boomers figure out, like, what do I do with this business? Do my kids want it or not? Or am I going to sell it to my employees or not? The questions that I'm asking as an entrepreneur changes, right? It goes from how am I going to, in the early days, it's how am I going to make my payroll every 2 weeks? In my case, I got to sell a 1966 convertible Thunderbird, right? Was the way I made payroll at one point. How do I do that versus, okay, now I'm sitting on cash, but playing golf every day isn't really my motivation as an entrepreneur. I've always been an entrepreneur. Now I want to go change the world. What do I do? How do I spend my time? How do I focus
Mm,
my effort? Right. And to me, that's what's exciting about working with entrepreneurs is they may have dimmed that I want to change the world for a little bit based on the reality of the business that they run. But when they exit the company, they're like, it's about more than buying a boat and sitting in the San Juan Islands or right, cruising through the French Riviera. There's more to it than that. And it's not about that's why I love entrepreneurs is that we tend to be grounded in the reality of the business and versus the folks who are like we raised money at a unicorn valuation. I'm like, great, you still have to deliver,
yeah.
right?
And where does legacy fit? I mean, as you go from sort of that financial stability to you start thinking about exit or you start thinking about what's next. Yeah, legacy. I know in my own mind, legacy is becoming more and more important, and money
hmm
and is becoming less important.
Yeah, I think for the founders, so I've been fortunate enough to be in part of nearly 25 transactions, three of my own, right? But working with other founders at the finish line versus the starting line. And I think that the big difference I say between that is one is I get a venture capital check wired to my business account. The other is I get a personal check or a check from the private equity or buyer wired to my personal account, right? So there's a big difference between those two accounts. Number one, I tell a founder, you have to think about what you want to do before you do this. And it's part of your decision of how you do an exit.
Hmm.
Because when I sold my first company, I drove from Washington to Colorado. It's a 17, 18-hour drive. And one day I was the founder CEO of a company I started, and the next day I didn't have any title or all of a sudden a lot of my identity changed. Well, it's very disruptive, right? Because you've settled into a skin you're used to, right?
Yeah,
So I'm a classic entrepreneur, Dave, and I was looking for my father's appreciation and approval. It never was going to happen. But yet that chip on your shoulder drives a lot of people, right? And as an investor, you're like, it's called the dad wound thing. You see somebody with a dad wound and you're like, that's a good investment because that person's going to just drive to no end, right?
yeah, yeah. I know what you mean. Exactly.
The challenge is that's a skin you become comfortable in, or at least that's what my therapist would say. So when you disrupt that skin, right, part of your identity changes. And you
Yeah,
have to be willing to be like, oh, this is going to be this is a change, right? Or if you take an outside investment or a majority investment, then all of a sudden the person is going to start telling you what they want done with the business, and that may be disruptive for you.
yeah,
So I think one, being aware that this change is going to happen as you make the transition in the business, and knowing that at some point you have to figure out what your planned exit strategy is with it, so it's not a surprise, right? So having some folks around you, whether that's an investment banker, an advisor, right, or therapist or a good friend who's willing to tell you the truth. I think it
Mm.
makes a huge amount of difference
Yeah.
because the significant that goes with it is like, wow, I was this and now I'm not some, what am I going to redefine myself as? And I think that that's a big transition that we see right now and this wealth transfer of baby boomers to the next generation. I also see more with with our kids age folks who are like, this is more about impact than it is about money, but it still has to be sustainable. So to your point, follow your passion and learn how to make money at it versus follow your passion and money will follow. I don't think the second one's true. I think you can follow your passion, but if you never learn to make money at it, it's just hard,
Yeah, it's a
right?
hobby.
And that's not realistic because the answer is in the market, you're worth what it costs to replace you. But in business, you're worth what the customer tells you you're worth. So big nuance, I realize to some people who haven't had the life experience, but not a nuance to those of us who have, right? Because if you can replace me for $1 an hour less in an entry level job, the answer is you're replaceable.
And when you sold your first business, did you feel a bit hollow, even if it was for 20 minutes and or for a
Oh,
week?
for
Or,
sure. So, because part of it is, what am I going to do next? Right. And well, I had a therapist, right, who was good at providing some coaching. I had some friends around. The challenge was on the friends is, and this as entrepreneurs, right? If your audience is like, I have a friend who's a school teacher. I love them. I adore them. They're awesome. They will never relate to my risk profile, and I'll never relate to their security profile.
yeah,
Right. And I remember having a pastor at one point who was like, you should just have a job. And I'm like, oh my gosh, why would I have a job? Like it was antithetical to the two statements were just the absolute opposites. Right. So I think that the thing that you have in community of entrepreneurs is there's other people like me that I can hang out with and they think the way I think versus, hanging out with my friend who's a teacher and they're like, I don't think the way you think at all. Right. And then I mentioned it earlier. Catherine and I have been married for 38 years, right? So she's much more risk averse, right? We have very different profiles. She puts up with the wackiness that is my world, right? And she's been the stability in that for our kids and all those things. So, choosing that life partner sounds like it's such an easy decision, right? When you're 20 something, but it will have the most dramatic impact and outcome of any choice in your life.
yeah. And for an entrepreneur, how important do you think a stabilizing force is for a crazy person?
Yeah, I think it is, right? It'd probably be that's a question you should ask her, but
Yeah,
having a
I'm going to ask
stabilizing
my
force
wife.
for, yeah, and for the kids, right? Because we've made a ton of money, we've lost a ton of money, we lost a house at one point, right? Because 2008 was a rough time to be an entrepreneur, right? And yeah, all those things, I would tell you from the objective perspective, what I will tell you about entrepreneurs is the current economic conditions don't matter a hoot to the entrepreneur. We are compelled by an idea to go take action.
Mm,
Right. And I remember being on a panel, Dave, at one point with a VC who was like, entrepreneurs love to start new businesses when the markets are down because things are cheaper. And I'm like, we don't think about that at all. Right. So when you started Brand Pie, it was probably like, I have this idea. I need to go do it. I'm compelled to go do it. I have people around me who are saying, yeah, you should go do it. And it's like, economic conditions and economic uncertainty at the sense of, in the same moment, you're like, didn't even give it a second thought.
yeah, no, the only thought I gave it was all my mates said, you're mad starting in the current economic environment. And I just went, it feels like the best time because everybody's eye will be off the ball. So I rationalized it into a sensible decision really easily.
Well, and I think is that's the gap as entrepreneurs that, we have to have people around us that both support us, but also people around us that question us. And you
Yeah,
have to know who's sitting in which camp. So you can, again, you're taking a ton of inputs. This is
yeah,
the self-awareness component. You're taking a ton of inputs and deciding which ones to prioritize and which ones to do. But I think, if you look at the math of failure in product startups, right, it's in the 90%. And a lot of that is because they don't do enough validation early on. They fall in love with the idea, they go pursue it, it fails. And the answer is, well, no one ever really succeeded without failing. That's not actually true either, because there are people who succeed right out of the gates. And, I admire them. I wasn't one of them, right?
yeah.
But
And I mean, we're sort of coming to the end of our time. If you were giving a potential startup three things to think about, we've got self awareness. Are there any other couple of things that come to your mind that they should sit down and think about that, isn't about money, but is about the temperament, the tenacity that they will need to succeed from day one?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd say is decide what it is you're after. What outcome do you? I've never been great at engineering my future and working my way backwards. I don't. I say this as advice that I'm giving myself right now. Like, what's the next decade of my life look like? How do I want to engineer it to have the greatest impact? Because it's no longer just about money. It's about impact and outcome,
Yeah.
right? Because now, as you know, because you and I are probably in similar vintage, right? It's no longer about money. It's about time, right? Where I talk to some younger entrepreneurs who are like, well, if this doesn't work, it's fine. I'm like, actually, no, right? Because the value of time is so much more important than the value of money. But you don't realize it until you have to think about time being compressed, right? So if you want a big exit, you can engineer for an exit. If you want to have impact, you can engineer for impact. If you want to engineer for the people you employ and giving them a great place to work, you can engineer for that. So start off by what end in mind do you really want to have from an aspiration standpoint? And how many years do you want to do it? So one of the things that I find with a lot of businesses that people start and they get to a point where they're like, this is not the business that I thought it was going to be, right? It's not a unicorn. It's a good business. Like it's paying my cash flow, but it's not a business that I love. And that's okay, right? It's like trying on a hobby and finding out that golf wasn't your thing. You wanted to do something else, right? Versus I know a lot of people who are like, I love this and I get up every day and it's not work. And because like to your point, you love what you do. Not everybody loves what they do. So you have to decide, do I want to love what I do? Do I want to sell the business? Right. At what point would I be happy with an exit? Because whenever we start through an advisory process, when you're in the M&A world, like I was for a decade, the question of the founder is, what outcome do you want here? Right. And if you start with that at least a rough idea, the answer is then you can look at it and say, is the company at a point that can deliver the outcome that I'm after, or do I need to redo my P&L and get more profit and take less money out of the company right now? And how do I restructure it to do that? But ultimately, you're going to ask the question, what do I do with this thing? Right? Because your kids may not want it, right? Depending on what culture you're in. In India, a lot of people take over businesses. In the West, a lot of people don't. So you have this dilemma that we see right now in the West, which is the baby boomers are trying to figure out what to do with these businesses, and their kids often don't want them.
Yeah.
And structuring it to sell to the employees is hard. So think about how you want to engineer your future. And even if you're not good at it like me, because I will tell you I'm not, when somebody's like, how do you want to orchestrate the rest of your life? And I'm like, oh my God, I have no idea. The last one I would say it's a question of your priorities, because as you do get to a later stage of your life, you're thinking more about time compression than you are about money.
Yeah.
And is this worth my time or not? Right. And just like in the early stage startup, you're defined by what you say no to, not what you say yes to.
Yeah.
And it's so hard, right? Because you're like, this sounds kind of interesting, right? I have a friend that did a year of yes. I don't know if you've heard that's a book about it, but he's an author, right? He's like, so I went and played a golf tournament in Scotland and I went fishing off the blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that sounds super cool, right? He's clearly at a point where the economics of it is not a challenge, but he's also a point where you can see he took a year to say yes to whatever people asked him to do, which is kind of wacky in some ways. I admire it, but as a business owner and entrepreneur, you're defined by what you say no to. So there's a new market opportunity, there's a new product opportunity, there's a new distribution opportunity, and those things impact your focus. So if you start off with self-awareness, you define where you want to go do, and then you define what you say no to.
That's it.
That's about as good as you're going to get.
Yeah. That's a perfect way to end. Absolutely fantastic. Now, when we do these, we usually end with a little fun story. I bet you have a great fun story from your days as a photographer. There's got to be some crazy, wacky story back there in time where you did something that you went like, whoa.
Yeah, well, there's a number of them, right? I think one of the things about being a photographer is I'm 16, 17, 8 years old, and I'm sitting on the floor of the Portland Trailblazers basketball team. So taking pictures of this back when the world was black and white for everybody who doesn't know. We used to use a thing called film. So I had a chance to do the Olympic trials, and I had a chance to do basketball, and I had a chance to the picture of Kissinger over my shoulder. There's Henry Kissinger, who was Secretary of State, and he was doing a fundraiser for a senator in Oregon. And I was trying to get the shot. I'm 17 years old, maybe 16 years old, probably. And I was trying to get the shot. And Kissinger was great because he looked at everybody once. But if you didn't get the photo of him looking at you, he would go to the next photographer and he'd scan the room, right? And so at one point I asked this guy to move so I could get the photo. And a photographer next to me said, you just asked Kissinger's press secretary to move. And I'm like, yeah. And but I was 16, so the answer is what do you know at
Yeah,
16, right? You're just trying to get the job done. But yeah,
brilliant.
super fascinating. And the other thing I got to cover that was really interesting was this thing called Mount St. Helens. So a
Wow, yeah,
little,
that was a big
which
one.
was kind of in my neighborhood. So I grew up hiking and hunting and fishing up there, and so to be able to cover it as a volcano exploding was pretty cool.
That's an explosive way to end the podcast, to say the least. I mean, absolutely fantastic talking to you, Dave, and a real privilege. So thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Pivot Points. If you enjoyed this episode, you can find more fascinating conversations with industry leaders in our previous episodes. You'll find us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want to know more about Brand Pi and how we deliver impact in the pivotal moments that matter to you, head over to brandpi.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.